begin now. Yeah. Okay, so once again, thank you all for coming to this week's session of, or this month's session of the Kant Reading Group. Today we have a guest speaker, Professor Reidar Maliks, who comes from the University of Oslo, where he is the lead researcher in the project Kantian Foundations for Democracy. He was a preceptor at Columbia University before acquiring his PhD, and then lecturer at the University of Harvard, and I believe also a researcher at Oxford, correct? So please welcome Professor Reidar. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Francesco and to Well for the kind invitation to come here. I'm very delighted to be here to speak. I was going to say speak to you, but I suppose speaking with you is better because this is supposed to be a reading group. And we all have a text, I think. And I have, in fact, prepared a PowerPoint because I thought it would be useful to just remind everyone about the text that we're reading today. So I think I need to. Do I need to share screen? Can you do this? So, oh, sorry. Oops. Okay, yeah, so I selected this text because I read it a long time ago and I thought it was a good text, and so I thought it would be a nice opportunity to read it again. And it's rich text, well written, and by a leading Kant scholar. It's Onora O'Neill. And as you know, the text called Kant and Social Contract Tradition. So I'll just, bring out some of the main points in this text, and then try and come up with a few questions at the end as we go along too, maybe. First of all, did you enjoy the text? Yeah. Okay. So there are a number of persons on Zoom as well, and feel free to interrupt or rather to join when you wish. And I suppose you just it's been a while since I talked on Zoom actually. I suppose you just either you just clear your throat and unmute and speak up, or you raise your hand, but I won't always be able to see the hands.
We usually let you speak for the whole duration, 45 minutes, and then take the questions. So,
okay. Okay, I'm not sure I have 45 minutes worth of speaking, but because I thought it was a reading group more than anything else. But I do have a few PowerPoints to show you. So don't know if I need to introduce Onora O'Neill. As you know, she is a student of Don Rawls, has notably defended the Kantian constructivist position, and it's written numerous books on Kant and ethics and politics. Yeah, let's just get into this text. See if I can minimize this like this. So the main claim of the text is asking whether Kant is a social contract theorist, and this is a question that has been asked before. You may be familiar with Patrick Riley's text from Political Theory in 1970. I think it has the memorable title on Kant as the most adequate social contract theorist. And according to O'Neill, the reason that Kant is the most adequate one is in the sense that Kant is not really a social contract theorist. Now that may sound a bit strange because, of course, the notion of a contract crops up here, and Kant consciously situates himself in this tradition, he refers to thus the notion of volente non fit injuria. So no wrong is done to someone who consents, and that seems to be very core in this tradition. So according to thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, insofar as we are subject to laws made by ourselves, we retain our freedom. And Kant has that notion. He does have the notion of original contract. Sometimes he calls it social contract, sometimes he calls it original contract. And so one would naturally think that he was a contract theorist. But he is not really, according to Onora O'Neill, because we have to think of the social contract type of thinking as based on something like an agreement or a contract, either hypothetical or actual, and Kant doesn't think in these terms. He doesn't think of the justification of the state. That's what this social contract tradition is concerned with, of course, the justification of the state, its justice, and also, of course, in the tradition from Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, also its legitimacy, its right to rule, and the content, duty of obedience. But for Kant, there's no actual agreement there. There's no contract, whether hypothetical or not. Instead, I'm quoting here from Onora O'Neill's article, the social contract is formulating the necessary conditions of the possibility of universal consent to a political order for untouchable yet interactive rational beings. Okay, so that's sort of the core of Onora O'Neill's claim. It's formulating the necessary conditions for the possibility of universal consent to a political order for unsociable yet interactive rational beings. All right, so let's just go through this, and let's first look at why we should be happy that Kant is not a social contract, according to O'Neill. So, as I said, the fundamentals of the tradition is that consent or agreement is justifying social and political institutions. Now, that can be either actual consent or hypothetical consent. And some of the problems here are well known, and she lists them in a very succinct and efficient manner. I think it's a very useful text to read in that regard. One of them is that it's not the social consent is not sufficient for justification. Right? So that's a familiar thought. Consent is not sufficient for justification. So in most countries in Europe, for example, it's not sufficient to consent to sell your organs to the highest bidder, for example, because it's considered morally odious, and one cannot consent to be killed, although in some societies, of course, euthanasia exists and is permitted by law, so there are discussions about exactly how far consent can go. There are lots of things that don't become right just because someone consents to it. So it seems that it can't possibly be sufficient for something to be justified. Somebody has consented to it. And she adds, it's also not necessary for all justification. There are lots of acts that don't really require consent at all, such as the relation between an adult and a child in the family. Lots of regulations that we are facing in society, including traffic regulations, are not really necessary, do not really require consent. So it's neither sufficient for justification nor is it necessary. And then she adds something very interesting, I think, about she doesn't mean that therefore consent is material, which right, so I just emphasize that, right? So you recall she has this two-stage procedure. So first, one must investigate the moral acceptability of something, such as selling kidneys for commercial purposes. And once the first stage, that of ascertaining the moral acceptability of something, has been settled, then in the second stage, then consents can matter. And so then persons can be bound to their sale of their inner organs can be justified at the second stage. So it doesn't mean to say that consent is not valuable, it's just not sufficient. But then she adds, and I thought that was very fascinating, further aspects of given consent that it's very hard really to ascertain what consent can justify, because consent is propositional attitudes, has to do with what's going on in somebody's mind, what they understand of the reality that they're signing on to, and they can only consent as far as they are in fact in agreement with what they're consenting to. And anyone who has downloaded an app or something has consented to a lot of stuff, right? I think it's that kind of stuff you're thinking about. So you consent to 10 pages of legal rights and obligations, and you just do it. Does your consent then somehow, does it have the power to justify that or to bind you in any way? Not clear. I remember another case of that is, if you remember, when in 2005 there was the attempt to create a constitution for the European Union, to gather all the various regulations that the European Union had into a proper constitution, which amounted to about 500 pages, which then was delivered in the mailboxes to every European citizen, and they were to vote on this in many. As you recall, that didn't go so well always, and so thus, how far does consent stretch? Well, only so far as the person who's consenting can be said to be in his or her right mind and understanding what's being consented to. So consent has limits. So it's hard to discern exactly what is consented to. And then there's the final problem with the consent, of course, which is also familiar from the rational choice kinds of traditions. Jan Elster's work on adaptive and addictive preferences. So we have all sorts of preferences that are contingent upon particular historical context. I guess one of the typical examples of this is the traditional housewife who has a preference for doing all the household chores at home, simply because that's what culture was at the time, that's what everyone expected of her, and so she has adapted her preferences to that. But if she's then put with the question of whether to consent to continuing to this situation, well, then she will consent to it. But of course, the origin of this is arbitrary in a certain sense, and the same is the case with addictive preferences for persons who are various forms under the influence. So actual consent has many flaws. So if Kant was supporting that kind of actual consent as a source of justification, then he would be in trouble. So fortunately, he's not doing that. Then she moves on then to hypothetical consent, which is familiar from I think it's pretty clear that much of this is based on her reading of John Rawls. So what persons would consent to in an original position, or doing other ones, the ideal speech situation. That's not actually taking place anywhere, but it's an attempt to establish what a ideally rational actor would actually do in a choice situation. And then based on that, Rawls came up, as you recall, with two principles of justice that say that all rational agents situated in the situation would come up. And she finds some problems with that too. And that's sort of she has two forms of the dilemma, I guess you could say, between metaphysical and political, which also, of course, recalls John Rawls' two stages in his career. In the metaphysical versions, where you really think of an idealized rational actor, then it will simply be false for many choosers. Lots of us aren't like the people, representatives behind the veil of ignorance. Maybe we are not risk averse. Some people enjoy risks, for example. So all these metaphysical assumptions do not fit for many choosers. So it's lack of realism there. And then the attempt to remedy that, of course, comes with the political versions. And so you recall that in the later stages of Rawls' thinking, in the famous 1985 article, Justice and Fairness, Political, Not Metaphysical. I'm just mentioning articles with excellent titles here. Another one. The problem with that is that it becomes too fact dependent. Right? So in the latter political Rawls, he talks about what citizens of states would consent to, given that they have to address each other through public utilities, etc. But then he's already presupposing that state borders exist and that citizens are of one kind or another. So, that's the problem, is the political solutions chosen to remedy the problems of the hypothetical sense of an idealized metaphysical kind. So, two horns of the dilemma, which just for Onora O'Neill sort of makes hypothetical consent difficult. So she moves on then to Kant's social contracts. And it's very brief what she's doing. It's just doing this on a handful of pages. So it's and I think that's the riskiness and the boldness of this piece too, comes from the fact that she's really going through this quickly. And the way she sets it up starts by his claim that past consent by others do not justify authority. So clearly, the fact that, and this is just what I'm saying, right? This is from the essay on theory and practice from 1793. So he speaks about the social contract in that essay. He also speaks about it in Metaphysics Morals. But she's probably right, actually, that his most extended discussion is in theory and practice. So there it says past consent by others do not justify state authority. So just the fact that lots of people in some time, long time ago, and sat down and agreed in a contract to found the state doesn't mean that we are that would be normatively binding for us. The only thing for Kant really that can be binding for us is the obligation to be in the states and the notion of the original, the notion of general will. But the mere fact that people had sat down some 100 years ago and agreed to the social contract doesn't bind us today. And apart from that, and that's not something that Neil mentions, apart from that, Kant thinks that the very idea of a contractual founding state doesn't make any sense, because that contract would be established in state of nature, right? In a condition prior to, and so there's no way in which people in anarchy who agree with each other, sign documents, and agree to join the state, because there's no legal, there's no laws establishing exactly what the nature of the contract is in terms of procedure or substance, and there's also an established authority that can uphold that contract. So there's no historical social contract. For Kant, instead, as Kant says, the social contract is an idea of reason, a rational principle for appraising any public rightful constitution. Okay, so it's an idea of reason, just like the categorical imperative. It's not something that we have recognition about, but it is an idea of reason. It helps us evaluate whether the constitution is a rightful one, and it is indeed a tool for legislators to discern whether what they are proposing is just enough. Right? So he has this model, right? That you have a state consisting of three branches of government, and legislative, executive, and judiciary, and at the point where they are where the legislature is proposing new laws, he has, or she has, although which is sexist, an infallible test of the justice of the legislation in the form of the written text, right? So, as he says, whether a constitution leads to happiness or welfare, or makes life better for anyone, that's difficult to know. That doesn't have to do with moral principles at all. That just has to do with happiness, welfare, what's conducive to it, and more problematically, what people think is happiness. Can be no principle for what people experience as conducive to happiness, because people are happy in different ways. But fortunately, when it comes to justice, to rights, it's possible to have an infallible standard for legislation, and that's the original contract, and that allows the legislator to test, and so Kant says, if it is merely possible that people could agree to a legislation, then the people have to admit that it is just, right? So it's a standard that the legislator uses, and it is it's what she calls a modal conception. By modal, she means that about possible consent. So, right, so it's not like the legislator is trying to think what the people really would want if they were very enlightened, rational actors. Not necessarily that, it's really a test of what they could not want, what they would have to refuse. And so you may remember the examples Kant gives of this, what kinds of legislation is incompatible with the social contract talks, tends to talk about matters of equality. So the social contract would rule out a hereditary rule of class, for example, class of root and rank that's only some people have. Because there's no way that people who are free and equal, they could not consent to being inherently subjected to others. And another example he talks about is the tax burden. So, the government may increase the taxes, perhaps because it's engaging in a war, and we may have all sorts of disagreements about whether this war was necessary or not, but it could be necessary. It's possible that it was correct to engage in this war. Therefore, one must say that we could do it. But let's say that the ruler distributes the tax burden unevenly among persons of the same rank. Well, that would be inequitous, and that's not something that everyone could agree to, because those who have the same rank and are treated as superior or are given a higher tax burden, they will not consent to it. And so the social contract as a model conception is based on the idea, of course, of universal consent. So we're modeling this notion that Kant takes perhaps from Rousseau of the general united will. Okay. Right. So sorry if I'm going through this. Just stop me and tell me. Right. So yeah. So this has what O'Neill calls substantive implications, and that's what she mentions. That's out of the idea of the original contract, social contract, comes the Republican Constitution, only the Republican Constitution. Because only that is capable of generating universal consent. And as you know, Kant always has a tripartite distinction there between freedom, equality, and independence. Don't know if I need to go through these, but by freedom he insists on the non-paternalistic government, which is organized solely according to the principle of universal principle of rights. Onora O'Neill's case of this is the universal principle of justice, but in the current Cambridge translation is the term used as right, really. But anyway, so the principle of justice or right should be governing according to which an action is right, only if it can coexist with the freedom of everyone else according to universal law, right? And that's the presupposition of maintaining in the states. And she thinks that Kant lists this as first principle of republicanism, so that's what follows from the original contract. Equality as well follows from that, although not economic equality. And then finally, independence of having the status of being one's own master, sui juris. Okay, then she goes into a bit what it means for the social contract to be an idea of reason, and here she goes into territory, which of course is controversial, and those of you who are interested in exactly the derivation of the universal principle of rights from the categorical imperative, or the failure of the derivation there, you may be familiar with the debates that have been going on for a generation or more. Alan Wood and Paul Geyer have made important contributions to these debates, because it's not exactly clear, right, how the principles of rights are related to the categorical imperative. So, yeah, O'Neill does sort of glosses over that. She doesn't engage in these kinds of debates, but it can be useful to keep in mind that it's not necessarily quite as simple as I will make a big impression here. But anyway, what she thinks is that you start down with the categorical imperative in the formula of universal law formulation, which is the supreme principle of morality. From that, you establish the universal principle of justice, or as I refer to it as the universal principle of rights, which is what she said, a restrictive version of the categorical imperative, specifically for the domain of interacting agents. And then she sets up the social contract, which she seems to think is an even more restrictive context. Let's say, you can say it's a scope condition, perhaps, because that's the universal principle of justice as applied to persons who are neither altruists or scattered on the planet, or neither altruists or hermits. Let's see, do I have another slide? Yeah, here we go. So, right, so the universal principle of justice, or right, as I say, is a restricted version of the categorical imperative for the external use of freedom. And so she doesn't really go deeply into what the domain of right is, except to say that the universal principle of justice is only concerned with outward action. So we are not really concerned with the duty to assume a maxim for the right reason. As you know, for the categorical imperative, the duty is only satisfied insofar as you act out of it, respect for the law. But that doesn't really, those kinds of duties are not part of the domain of right. It's only about outward action. And the universal principle of justice is only concerned with maxims structuring external action for the public domain. So it's only our actions, our specific performance that matters here, normally anyway, or there are, of course, times where in order to interpret what an action is, one must make reference to the intentions of the agent, but fine, it's nonetheless, the duties are to perform certain actions. And it's only concerned with those maxims, the subgroup of maxims for outward action that have to do with structuring the public domain, structuring external action, structuring the public domain. And so she claims that the universal principle of justice rules out actions that could not be consented to were adopted by law. So actually, sure, she describes the universal principle of justice by reference to consent as well, for modal conception of original contract. I was a bit stunned by perhaps her description of right. I don't know. It's a short text, but did you feel that? And this question, did you feel that she had sort of fully elaborated the distinction between the categorical imperative and the universal principle of right? Nothing. Do you have a sense what's lacking, Francesca?
I mean, I don't really, or I think this will actually be a question for you too, Cedric, but when she said that the categorical imperative is both inward and outward concerning, and then the universal principle of justice is illustrated in the sense that it's only outward or concerning the public domain. I have some questions or doubts about whether this actually applies only to the public domain in the sense of like the structuring of the society, or whether it is just applying the categorical imperative to the private domain interactions between two persons. So I'm not sure if this makes sense, but it seems like there isn't much of a difference between just the categorical imperative when thought of as regulating the way we should act towards others, and then the universal principle of justice being restricted for only the domain of the political just. It seems like it is also the categorical imperative applied to the interaction people even within the private domain, at least from the description she is using. So I didn't really understand how it's exactly different from the categorical imperative.
Oh, okay. Well, one way it's different, of course, is that the duties are different. That it's only a specific action that's required in the domain of rights. But yeah, I think that's a very good point that you're pointing out, that of course rights has to do also with relations between individuals, not just with the relations for structuring the states. And that may be sort of pointing a little bit also towards what's a little bit sort of not mentioned here, which is the entire private rights section of the metaphysics of morals, right? So Kant has this step-by-step process where he builds up the domain of rights, first in terms of the innate right to freedom that we have, and then in terms of acquired rights we have, acquired rights to property, to contract, to status relations, and these of course are private rights relations between individuals. So it's not like he just takes the universal principle of justice and applies it directly as a method to generate this law, either for the state or it goes through very elaborate step-by-step process of thinking what really does freedom require of us. Well, it does require the possibility of property. It does require the possibility of acquiring the rights to the performance of contract mandated duties. It does require the possibility of engaging in various social endeavors together, etc. Okay, so of course the rights is much more complex than this, and crucially, of course, rights is not just about structuring the public domain according to some established norm, but about establishing particular relations between individuals. So when Kant sets up the definition of rights, it first says that it has to do three aspects to it, right? It's about the external actions among persons who unavoidably interact. It's about our choices, not about our needs, desires, etc. But it's really about our choices when we're interacting. And the third point is that it's about the formal relation between choosing persons, not about an attractive end. So there's a very strong relational aspect to the notion of right, which is a little bit underplayed in this story here. And then my next question is, if consent already enters in the universal principle of justice, why do we need the social contract? We can perhaps come back to that in the discussion, because that really is a question. Kant starts off as legal philosophy with establishing the universal principle of justice and the notion of innate right to freedom. And if, as she suggests, those by themselves can decide on right and wrong, what people could possibly consent to, then why do we also need a social contract? Let me, before we approach that, we can go to the next step of our argument from the universal principle of justice to the social contract. And this is my last slide. Right. So, as I said, there's three levels here. It starts with the categorical imperative, then the universal principle of justice is the restricted version of it, and then the social contract is an application of the universal principle of justice for a specific type of human beings. Scope condition. So she argues that the universal principle of justice in itself does not require state structures and coercion. That's sort of a free-floating principle, just like the categorical imperative, that could potentially guide our action even without the state. The reason we need the state and coercive structures are that humans are not altruists or hermits, right? So we not scatter on the planet, we unavoidably interact with each other. And when we do interact, we're not altruists. And so we need coercion in order for people to have assurance that their rights are protected. That's why we need a social contract, she says. Her claim then is, under actual conditions, the universal principle of justice can only be realized by the social contract, specifying that for us, only Republican institutions can achieve possible consent. So that's interesting. So there's something about the human condition here. There's a realist element that enters about human finitude that mandates that we need something like social contract. I need to think more about that myself. I don't fully understand this. Therefore, I have a few questions. So what exactly does the social contract do that the universal principle of justice does not do? And Kant emphasizes that a priori nature is claiming that state institutions are a precondition for right, but can that be reconciled with Onora O'Neill's realism? That's another aspect of this. As you remember, early on in the public rights section, Kant really says that, you know, it's not from the experience of human beings as selfish and acquisitive, etc., that we know that we need state structures. We need them because even if persons were, you know, willing to abide by law in pre-state society, it wouldn't be possible to, from an omnilateral point of view, establish what right and wrong is. So it doesn't seem to have, this conception that O'Neill has seems to be remedial, that the state is a remedy for the fact that we are not altruists, doesn't quite seem to square with the a priori principle that contests that the state is not really, doesn't have this sort of cognition notion of the state. Yeah, so I have numerous questions here, but we can ask them in turn, and you have probably lots of things to say too. This my time, I noticed that my time is up for this presentation, so I think I'll just say thank you and then continue with the event.
Okay, so we will now move forward for discussion. So anyone who has a question here in the classroom, can raise their arm, or the same can apply in Zoom. You can either type in the chat or react with the hand to place a question. Does anyone have a question or comment?
Hi, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Hi, I'm Andre. Well, I have like one point to make, and then a question. The point's a quick one. I struggle with the text because it seems to me, the way I see it, it's kind of focusing on what I regard to be a straw man. Because I don't understand what she understands by the social contract tradition as being a human whole, especially when she talks about consent equating with justification and justification equating justice. I understand this from a post-Rawlsian point of view, but if you go back to the early moderns and the moderns, I don't see this as descriptive of anything that you are doing. That's similar coming up with consent as one mechanism to explain the origins of government. And then there are other mechanisms that are brought up to understand whether there is justice that comes about from that form of organization, that nature and so on. We look at Locke and we see that the whole point is protecting the rights of nature. We look at Rousseau and we see that the whole point is to find preservation of freedom and legitimacy. So it's not directly about justice. But my problem here at the start is there any social contract author at all from this viewpoint that is not strictly John Rawls? So that the first one but that's just my first one comment on the comment. But I do have one question, which is the part in which I struggled the most with the paper, which is how quickly she makes the interpretation of that passage in theory and practice in which the contract comes up, and how she understands that could be called to as being modal instead of hypothetical, because she completely disregards the expression as if, that is the also, which is too important to underline. The also is a counterfactual that is inserted into the very procedure by which Kant seems to understand the notion of agreement. So the way I see this counterfactual is not so much as a call to an idealized consent by an idealized person. That's what I think I do. But I don't see it strictly as being a possible universal consent either, because you can think of a sort of presumption rule on consent that includes a counterfactual that if person X were called to give her opinion on the collective will of a certain specific policy in idealized conditions of information and rationality, then person X would have given her consent. This is hypothetical, not strictly modal. So that's my question to you. How would you see this add if this not all features into the original contract in theory and practice? To it seems like she makes an right? Unjustified leap from the notion could have given an agreement to saying that it's modal, it's not hypothetical. Because it still seems that there's something hypothetical in it, to tell you the truth. How would you regard it?
Yeah, that's seems, I mean, clearly any modal conception will say something about what, you know, hypothetically could be the case or not, or around what hypothetically what would have to be rejected. But I don't see why this social contract per se would not be used for a legislature to generate some notion of what people, you know, could possibly consent to. And there are some aspects of that for but he does seem to say that this is kind of a, well, he talks about this as an infallible guide, right? I have to think more about it, but it seems like nothing really rejects that option. I think that what a hypothetical, what idea of the original contract really does is to model the universal principle of rights according to the perspective of the agents rather than just the perspective of the state. What is possible that persons could or could not agree to, whether it is exclusively connected to this what they could not agree to. I think you may be right, which is saying more than there is. Well, Kant certainly doesn't say that.
It's interesting, sorry if I could just short forward, that you mentioned the expression like an infallible guide, because that's exactly the adjective that Rousseau uses for the general will as exercised by theory. So the general will is infallible insofar as it is contractualized by people who win inside the general will become infallible. So that there's a that much of a proximity between that idea of hypothetical that appears in Rousseau's general will.
I think
But it's good to talk.
yeah, I don't know the full answer. I think maybe part of the reason why this comes off in terms of rejectability rather than affirmation is that Kant here is concerned with establishing the authority of the state. Right? So in these cases, he tries to find out when subjects are under an obligation to take something as being just. And for that purpose, for that limited purpose of establishing what could be just or not, I think the modal conception is sufficient. So maybe that Kant has a more restricted purpose in those passages.
Are there any more questions or maybe follow up on this particular question?
Short follow-up. They had exactly the same question. Mainly because when I was in the faculty, we were precisely told that the social contract as an idea of reason according to Kant was kind of as it goes exactly. So that perhaps this is a more a new Kantian interpretation of this idea. But my question has also to do with this traditional modern times distinction between history and conjectural history. And according to the traditional modern contractualists, the idea, using this term, multi-mechanism of the social contract belongs basically to the realm of projectors. We don't know exactly the origin of the state, but we can basically imagine that something like a social contract happened. And the difference between this tradition and Kant tradition is precisely that he rejects this idea that basically substitutes this with an hypothetical version of the social. It is no more a conjecture, but now it is an hypothesis that actually can exactly function as if cause, and the government has to act as if the citizen / subject has to obey as if the social contract was signed. So there is also this kind of debate that was, so to speak, internal to the traditional contractual that we have to understand in order to understand Kant's interpretation of the social contract.
Yeah, no, of course, conjectural history is a mere speculation on some level, right? It doesn't have any cognitive, verifiable content. So there is some analog or something, perhaps. Except, of course, that conjectural history is teleological, the notion of that nature has a secret plan for us. The notion that we can adopt a certain perspective on history, which allows us to think of it as being a secret plan of nature. And yeah, I mean the social contract and the origin of society is detailed in that story, but of course it doesn't come with any moral implications for us. Doesn't generate any rights or duties from conjectural history. Whereas the idea of the original contracts is a way, I think, of manifesting what the universal principle of right means in an actual context of legislation. So it is I'm not sure I understand fully the parallel, but it serves a separate purpose, which is to establish what could count as, or what could and could not count as justice, what would be ruled out by commitment to justice. Whereas it doesn't come with doesn't change the moral situation. It's not like, in that regard, it's very different from an actual contract. It doesn't. It's not like, okay, now we've run the tests. It's clear that you would have consented to a number of things. Therefore, you are now morally obliged to. It's not like that. You're morally obliged to the state, no matter what. It's just a test, really, for justice. It's a guide for the justice of legislation.
If it is a test or a guide, why do not interpret it as an assessment clause? If it is a test or a guide for the legislation, why you cannot interpret it as simply as an as-if clause, so in a hypothetical way?
I think in a sense it must be. It's just not. It's not a factual consent or anything. So it is a hypothesis, but it is not a hypothesis about what the people would in fact agreed to. So in John Rawls's conception, he established this way of reasoning, a mechanism that just generates various principles, two principles of justice. Whereas I think it doesn't tell us what people actually would agree to. It tells us what they would have to rule out. That's how Kant uses it anyway. So right, so that kind of injustice, inborn ruling rank, for example, that would have to deal with that. Now, of course, the flip side of that is that it does tell us that principles of regulating interaction between humanitarian. So in that sense, it tells us something substantial. But the way Kant thinks of it, it seems, I don't know, the examples he gives them are about, and the proposal language that's Onora O'Neill defined, indicates that that's primarily a negative test for what we told.
I just said something. Isn't that the problem we have technical the difficulty is that it usually comes with idealization of conditions of sense. That's the point. It's not so much a hypothetical per se, so the point that is traditionally as a broad point that the hypothetical statements comes with idealizations of the conditions for real. That's what according to O'Neill Kant of his interpretation of this version of the discussion pattern would allow us to avoid. It's not so much the house of itself, because they could always come in place at the second stage. That's something that understands the intellectual process. Okay? So I think the point is about the idealization that comes with the way it is the hypothetical consent. Right?
Yeah. No, that's very helpful. That's it. Yeah, that's
Yeah, I think that sorry, and then I think she makes a point because the idea of as she interpreted it, presenting the transition from positive consent to the aspects of the Republican constitutions, the derivation that can tell us what to do. I think that's it is partially or initially allows us to avoid some difficulty concerning idealization. I think, of course, with idealization comes the difficulty of the agreement, of course, because not everybody will agree with the idealization that I think proposed by anyone. I think that it's covered in the text. I understand.
That seems right to me. It seems like she is, by all means possible, trying to avoid a situation where too many presuppositions about human agencies is baked into the model. But then the question is really, what then is the purpose of the original contract? I have my views on that, but it is a real question because, of course, the moral work seems to be done by the notion of the universal principle of justice and by the innate right to freedom and the whole set of rights and duties that people are under, right? Or that it can be under. So that's where all the moral work is done. What then is the contribution of this idea of original contract?
My bad. Perhaps now we could maybe get a question from anyone at home that's watching through Zoom. don't think anyone has a question right now, so please go ahead.
Thanks for the presentation of the text. Actually, my questions has been exhausted. I had one regarding why speaking of possible consent rather than hypothetical consent. One about stressing the negative version of that, a test of what they could not want. And also another one, but I'd like if you could elaborate a bit on this. You have been doing a great job on this relation between right and virtue in Oslo. And actually I had some issues with the narrow way take it to be that Onora O'Neill takes the relation between the UPR, the universal principle of right or justice, and the categorical imperative. Does it necessarily, is it necessary a derivation from the categorical imperative to the UPR? Is the relation, is like matters of right always in Kant, a derivation of ethical questions? I'd like to have your take on this, and perhaps if taking this the other way around, say, would have any kind of implication for O'Neill's argument. And well, then I'll have a very short question, but I'll leave it to after that.
Yeah, no, so, I can only wave towards this massive discussion that's going on. I haven't made any personal contribution to that, although, so as you may know, there are some people who insist that the universal principle is not derived from the categorical imperative, and there are some who insist that indeed it is. It seems, everyone agrees that these two principles are regulating different types of duties and different types of demand. Okay, so that's not where the disagreement seems to be. Everyone knows that duties from the categorical imperative have to do with the intentional duties of right, have to do with the performance of actions, and there seems to be consensus also that the categorical imperative regulate primarily the moral domain of an individual, whereas duties of right regulate relations between individuals and specifically as they are interacting with states. Kant himself, of course, it seems is quite keen on connecting the universal principle of rights to the categorical imperative. He even has a formulation at 6230, where he, after defining the universal principle of rights, he formulates it in the form of an imperative sentence, just like the categorical imperative. Acts only according to your actions ought to be such that they're compatible with everyone else's actions in the law. So he seems to, and here and there he speaks of it as a categorical imperative. I don't know. I feel a bit uncomfortable with that in a sense, because it seems to me that when he developed the groundworks for the metaphysics of morals, he was not really prepared for everything that was to come, and his way of thinking developed as he went along. And so to assume that the principles he had first developed can just be adopted to the second stage seems to me to be
historically inaccurate, perhaps, and fraught with all sorts of problems. I don't really know. I mean, the way I see it, the way he presents it clearly in the metaphysics of morals is that human beings are persons who have moral agency, and therefore they can be subject to laws of freedom. And these are all in the big moral domain, and there are some laws of freedom that concern ethics, or the virtue actions that we can do, which have to do with the maxims to choose certain ends. So, and that's really where the kind of duties that he describes in the groundworks of the metaphysics of moral come in. And there are other kinds of duties that have to do with specific actions, so the rights and wrongs, where the incentives don't really matter. So use and ethics are the two subdivisions of moral, right? It's the top view. And what is that thing there? That's from which presumably use and ethics are derived. Is that the categorical imperative? Maybe it is. It might also be some super imperative or some categorical imperative of some sort. So the logic of non-contradiction, some sort. The way I see it, Kant is clearly keen on there being some kind of derivation from a higher principle. He doesn't perform it himself, but at least that's what his intention is. That's about all I can say about that. But you had another comment as well.
Yeah, it's a different question. We actually O'Neill mentions and Kant himself, I think. Well, O'Neill mentions this idea of the social contract as an idea of reason, and then we have like, why do we need the social contract? Because you put it there, I think so. Yeah, universal principle of justice or of right plus enforcement. This is the basis for the social contract. And how could an idea of reason play any role in enforcing anything? Or I think like the idea is also that the universal principle of right can only be realized by the social contract. And how can something be realized by an idea of reason?
Well, we cannot fully realize, obviously, an idea of reason. We're always, on some stage towards that kind of perfection. So it's not like, I mean, I suppose how it works is that you have an idea of reason, which is the contrast, which is the assumption that anything must be possible to be presented to that as an obligation. So we are under an obligation to achieve, and that's the ideals that result from this idea of reason. We can never achieve it.
Right.
We can only approach it. Every society is, there's a cutoff point where you have moved out of the state of anarchy. So what we do know for sure is that if there is an existing society with laws and institutions, etc., at least we can know for sure that with some certainty that we've moved out of the state of nature. But the achievement of this of the idea of reason is always insecure and if that's what you meant. Right?
Yeah. Thanks.
We still have 15 minutes. Is there any other question?
Just have something to question regarding the relation to the reversion from the It's interesting that she presents the technological imperative as deriving from the supreme principle of creativity, any principles related to the justify this to be agreed by. So it's interesting because kind of develops the category comparative as in a sense already as something that has to be agreement. Because and I think this is what makes the connection there between the comparative and comparative. UPG being, an application, distinctive in scope, application of the comparative. I don't know if I'm clear. So the idea is that for her, I think that she doesn't look at the development comparative as strict as a moral expression. So there's something more. But at the same time, this creates a kind of circularity because the development comparative in itself, in this formulation, does not as directly imply the factor of unity. So you can establish a moral law, a moral principle, without directly appealing to the definitions of freedom. Directly.
Yes.
So there's a kind of circularity there, or kind of tension or conflict in the way he derives one thing from the other. But I think that the question you raised in the expedition that June was driven about the derivation from the UPG from the comparative has to be the way she understands when she derives it from the principle of characteristic, which for her is intrinsically about the conditions for women. Not precisely, not just mainly or much about conditions for women. I think that helps to understand the derivation from the categorical comparative. As a proof of political instance of comparative. But okay, this is just the hypothesis that maybe this could help to understand at least the way of this the structure of Kant's because of this discussion.
That's very interesting. In reasoning about the categorical imperative, in testing our maxims, of course, we're always individuals. We're individuals, but also objective in the sense that every individual will have to come to.
I say, oh yes, I do. But that's not directly because of there's something more substantial, more material than more rational. So they're kind of, but at least because of the Rosian influence of her, she's playing on those.
Yeah.
Maybe.
But I think there is also something a little bit odd about saying about this formulation about the restricted version of the categorical imperative, simply because it doesn't seem to take into account that it really is a different set of duties. The categorical imperative is act according to the maxim that you put at the same time become universal law. The obligations in that are of completely different. It's the obligation to act for the respect of the moral law. And if you take that and you're restricted to that which is solely about external action and about the structure of society, as she says, right? So categorical imperative here, you restrict it to just be about external action and about the conditions of society. I suppose she intends that to exclude, for example, imperfect duties to others, or imperfect duties to yourself or something. It's only about interaction insofar as it is necessary for society or something. It's still the case that the duties of justice are of a completely different sort. They're not duties to take on a particular incentive at all. So to me, just seems intuitively strange. To say that it is sort of, it's categorically imperative, apart from all sorts of domains that are not relevant to social interaction, because it's sort of a different type of.
Is there any other comment or question? Yeah.
There's something that I didn't quite understand in this last comment, which is how are they different duties? I understand that there are different mobiles, like the whatever's ruled by external coercion will not have ethical duty as the mobile for the action. But I don't quite understand how one could separate them entirely and just say they're completely different spheres. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit further on that.
Well, I'm not sure I can say much more than what I already intended to say. That, of course, the categorical imperative also generates, demands that act towards other people. So it's not, I don't need to say that it's sufficient that you assume a particular state of mind. That's not the difference. The difference is just that the duties that can be enforced are such that you are not required to have any incentive. And it seems to me that the categorical imperative, although it concerns duties, but we have to act in a certain way towards others, we have to not make false promises, etc. It still seems like the satisfying the duty doesn't have to do with the performance of that action, but it has to do with doing it for the right reason. So it's just a different category of duties, and for that reason, to me, it's strange to say that you just have all those duties created by the categorical imperative, and you just take a subgroup and you call them duties of rights.
Thanks, Professor.
I want to pick up on your challenge on the first question and that you re-emphasized it from the discussion. And I want to ask you two questions regarding your challenge. The first is the way you read the universal principle of right. Sorry, I can't I just have to tell you, it's not a universal principle. It's a universal principle. As if we took away the social contract, is it a sufficient mechanism to explain the origin of publicity, the way Kant understands it in the metaphysics of the world, as providing that mechanism of going from provisional types of rights, instead of nature to parental kind of rights? It seems to me like that would be the sort of thing that social contract would add to the notion of the universal principle. It doesn't seem like it's very explicit there. That's my first question. The second is more textual based and hermeneutical. When we compare theory and practice with the metaphysics of the world, O'Neill seems to be right that the social contract features much prominent theory and practice than in the metaphysics of the world. But it seems like the opposite happens with regard to the universal principle of rights, right? And when she mentions the social contract in theory and practice, she does so on the second section, which has a subtitle that says something like quota halts. Yeah. So my question is, would this be the challenge that we put forward? Something that we could see in the very opposition between the texts, and that's somehow historically explained by looking at the chronology or how can the text somehow, I don't know, add a different perspective in the metaphysics of the world. Yeah, kind of show yeah, I don't know. That's
That's super interesting. Both questions are great, and I think the first is really comment or contribution to understanding what the independent contribution of the state contract as an idea is. And Yeah, I think that seems right to me, what you're saying, that this. It is a way of thinking about the transition from a private rights situation to a public rights situation. So. Yeah.
We have also to consider that we have people is, for instance, and define the principle of this as a transcendental principle of public rights.
Yes, right. So if you really think of the principle of publicity, I thought you meant like transition from private to public right. But because of course the idea of the original contract is a way of conceiving of that transition from a private rights situation to a public rights situation. So there's the postulate of practical reason which requires us to enter the states. So when we do that, we have to think of ourselves as being subject only to our own law and will, and that's the idea of the original contract. So I suppose one of the contributions on this thinking of the contract for Kant is to just make explicit the moral notion that the state exists for a purpose, which is to secure your freedom, and that's the condition that anyone possibly could give up their freedom to join the states. And we think of this in terms of some kind of contractual relation, because that's the way we think of us being free and at the same time subordinate to authority or something. So that the contribution somehow must be, the contribution of the contract must be there in terms of thinking, in terms of what it takes to go from a situation of anarchy in South to a situation of the States. But I think you also drew an analogy to the principle of publicity, which is not in the metaphysics of morals, but in the piece, right? Yeah, and the principle of publicity says it's a negative test, ruling out maxims or policies if they could not be, compatible with publicity. And I think that's very nice, actually. That's also something that occurred to me vaguely, that seems like the notion of the original contract seems to play sort of some similar kind of role. It's a way of striking down something. The principle of publicity strikes down something that couldn't be part of a constitution, because no one could agree to create a constitution with these kinds of clauses that permit resistance, revolution, or the international domain that permits preemptive strikes and stuff. And it seems like the original contract plays a similar kind of role as a test of what it's been. And then you're also pointing to the development of Kant's thinking in this particular domain, and it is.
And I haven't even thought of this new edition from the perpetual piece, but add it like as a trip. I struggle. I teach history of political philosophy here, but one of the lectures we have is on Kant, and I usually want to talk about something that relates to Kant, and sometimes it's social contract. But we have time constraints, so I have like one lecture on Kant. So I have to choose like one text, and I never know which one to choose. I choose theory and practice. I choose metaphysics of morals. I choose perpetual peace. I can't choose all three. Now I'm thinking that I'm struggling even more because now I'm thinking that perhaps I do have to approach the three, right? So because it seems like there's it's not a complete overlap between what I'm saying and the theory and practice on this, and on metaphysics of morals, and exactly something.
Yeah, no, it's quite that there's an analogy in that sense.
Okay, so our time is up. We have final questions. I will really quickly.
Oh, please, one of the questions you put up there, what exactly does a social contract do that the right does not? And I was wondering whether that's exactly the formulation you might want to go with, if you're already saying that the basis for the social contract is the universal principle of right plus important, because it seems to me then that you'd have to ask first what the universal principle of right do that the categorical imperative does not, if they are derived from different sources. Because if they are, I don't see how the categorical imperative really be categorical. It seems to me that it has to be all encompassing. And it seems to me that enforcement is a more obvious step to take from there. So either the universal principle of right is a sort of sectional cutout of the categorical imperative, right? So it applies and implies only partially what the categorical imperative already did, or it's derived from different principles, which would mean that it might either condone or indeed imply things that the categorical imperative does not, and then it's doing a fully different thing. And I think that would negate the categorical imperative as categorical in itself.
Okay.
So my question is, what exactly do you need besides the categorical imperative and enforcement implied by the social contract? What's the middle step that you need the principle right for?
Well, I think the principle of right just regulates a lot of things that the categorical imperative as formulated in one word is not about. It's about the external relations between interacting agents who are performing choices towards each other.
But are those choices, I mean, would those choices not be commanded by the categorical imperative? Because if so.
Well, it's just it doesn't it concerns the specific actions of interacting agents as they stand in relation to each other. Now, all those actions can also be governed, of course, by the categorical imperative. But that just generates a different kind of duties. Whereas here we're interested in the duties that human beings are under that can be enforced. The duties specifically to ensure that a person's freedoms are secured. And we're not talking then about freedom as in the sense of more autonomy, but freedom as in the sense of being independent of the choices of others. And that's not really the kind of freedom that you get in the categorical imperative. It's standing in a juridical relation to others so that you're free to use your body and your properties as you please without being under the thumb, let's say, of a master.
Okay, so I believe it is now time to wrap up. I would like to remind everyone that this session, as it was recorded, will be available at IFILNOVA's YouTube channel. For those of you who are with us here, we are going to have a lunch break, and then at 2 p.m. we will have a masterclass also with Professor Reidar on Kant and the French Revolution, which is based on a Cambridge element published by the professor. So for those of you who are here, please feel free to join us, and that extends obviously to those of you at home. Whoever is available and interested, please join online. And it will take the same format, so you can also post questions afterwards, and we will discuss the presentation. So thank you, Professor, and thank you everyone for joining us.